Just one ship. Why? They were expecting a fleet. Yes. Oh, why did humanity send only one ship? The hall fell silent when I entered. Not the polite silence of people waiting. Not the respectful silence of ceremony. It was the kind of silence that happens when 17 civilizations look at something and cannot quite believe what they are seeing. I felt every eye in that chamber turn toward me the moment the doors opened. I kept walking. My name is Yara Solis. I am the commanding officer of the UES. Unconditional. And that morning, I was the only human in a room built to watch my species kneel. The Varith Conclave was beautiful in the way power often makes things beautiful. The chamber floated inside a neutral orbital station above a star that was slowly dying. That was not an accident. Whoever chose this place understood symbolism. A dying star was a reminder. Everything ends. The walls curved inward from every side, and the rows of seats rose high above the floor like an ancient coliseum. They were filled with delegates from species whose names I'd spent 6 months memorizing. The Varith Coalition occupied the center point, 7 species under one banner. The largest organized military force the known galaxy had ever sent against one civilization. Against us, against Earth. They had destroyed 3 of our fleets in 18 months. Let that sit for a second. 3 full fleets, ships, crew. Years of work, lives, dreams, everything gone. The Varith had done it cleanly, efficiently, and without what I would call unnecessary cruelty, which in galactic politics apparently counts as restraint. After the 3rd loss, Earth's Unified Council sent a formal message to the Conclave. We accepted the invitation to attend surrender negotiations. 17 civilizations came to watch humanity sign away its colonization rights, agree to reparations, and reduce its military reach to a shadow of what it had been. They expected a fleet to arrive for the ceremony, a team minimum, an honor guard, some final display of pride from a species that had been beaten, but we sent one ship. That I walked to the center of the chamber where a single podium waited under the lights. Facing the curved wall of delegates, that I wore my dress uniform. Dark blue, silver trim along the collar, and a weapon on my HFY in my hand. I carried a small case, the kind used for documents or personal effects. Dark metal, simple latch. Nothing dramatic. I set it on the podium and looked up at the room. Kavas sat in the central Varith seat above the rest on the coalition tiered. He was large by any standard. The Varith are built like someone took the idea of strength and gave it shape. Heavy gray plating across the shoulders at a face that gives very little away to human eyes. But I had studied him. Every report, every speech, every account from neutral parties who had dealt with him, that I knew what kind of mind lived behind that controlled exterior. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at the doors behind me, expecting more people to enter. Then he looked at the empty floor beside me. Then he looked back at me. Commander Solis, he said in Galactic Standard, with the calm weight of someone who never needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. Is the rest of your delegation still aboard your vessel? No, I said. I am the delegation. That was when the murmuring started. Not from Kavas, that he was too disciplined for that. It came from the galleries, from the neutral observers. From the smaller coalition species who had expected theater and were now getting something they did not know how to read. I heard translation systems working at speed. That I heard a sharp clicking sound from the Sesseth delegation that I would later learn was their version of startled laughter. Kavas was still for a moment. Then he said, with the careful control of someone making an effort to sound generous, we had expected a larger attendance, given the significance of today's proceedings. I appreciate that, I said. We felt one representative was enough. For a surrender, he asked. For conversation, I said. The murmuring doubled. A sharp sound cut through the upper gallery. Kavas raised one hand, and the room went quiet with the speed of long habit. He leaned forward slightly. Commander, Earth's Council accepted our invitation to negotiate terms of cessation. Those terms have been prepared and reviewed by all member species of this conclave. We were expecting a formal ceremony, a signing, a close to this conflict. Then let's have that, I said. I brought something for the table. I opened the case. Inside was a crystal data core about the size of my fist, resting in a simple foam frame. It caught the chamber light, and through fractured reflections across the podium, I lifted it, walked to the treaty table at the center of the floor, and placed it down carefully. Then I returned to the podium and stood with my hands at my sides. Kavas looked at the data core, then at me. Every diplomat in that room was staring at that small object as if it might suddenly become dangerous. That, I said, is what humanity brought. One data core, Kavas said, yes. He was silent again. When he spoke, there was something new in his voice. Not anger, not contempt, something closer to caution. The tone of someone beginning to suspect that a surprise is coming and not yet knowing whether that is good or bad. Why? He asked carefully. Did humanity send only one ship? I met his eyes. I let the question hang there in that enormous chamber before 17 civilizations above a dying star. Then I said, because one ship was all this required. No one spoke, but the silence had changed. The first silence had been disbelief. This one was different. This one was the silence of people starting to wonder if the small thing in front of them was not small at all. Kavas gave one slow nod. He motioned to one of his aides, a young Verith officer, who stepped forward and lifted the data core from the table. We will review its contents, Kavas said. Take your time. I replied, yes. I waited to you know what a person thinks about while waiting for the strongest military coalition in known space to open a box? I can tell you what I thought about. I thought about Owen Carr. Owen was a propulsion engineer, 43 years old, had a son named Luke who wanted to be a pilot, and he had the kind of laugh that made other people laugh too. Not because the joke was always good, just because his laugh was real, warm, unforced. The kind that comes from a person who honestly finds the world funny. He had been aboard the second fleet we lost, that he never came home. I think about Owen when I need to remember why the thing we built had to be exactly what it was, not bigger, not louder, not built from grief, not built from rage. Those things make people brittle. What we built came from something colder and more useful. The understanding that the only way to honor the people we lost was to make sure we never lost anyone that way again. Let me tell you about the 22 months between the destruction of the Third Fleet and the morning I walked into the Verith conclave. After the third loss, Earth's defense councils met in closed session to NO press, NO public feeds, NO official statements beyond the message accepting the Verith surrender invitation. TO the rest of the galaxy, humanity went quiet. Quiet the way a deep ocean looks quiet from the surface while something enormous moves below. That meeting produced one directive. Not more ships of the kind we had already built. Not larger versions of the same failed approach. Not another attempt to answer defeat. With volume. Something different. Something that required the kind of patience that is very hard to hold on to when you are angry. And we were angry. IT also required the kind of patience that is hard to hold when everyone keeps asking why you are not doing something visible. And they were asking. The program was called Project Long Patience. I did not name it. I inherited it when I was given command of the unconditional 14 months into development. The first time I heard the name, I thought it was strange for a military project. Later, when I understood what we were building, I realized it was the only name that made sense. The unconditional was built inside Jupiter's upper atmosphere. That detail matters. Jupiter's massive electromagnetic field hid everything: construction emissions, energy readings, system tests, even live fire trials from the new systems we were installing. Any long-range scanner watching from the outer system. Jupiter still looked like Jupiter. Huge, indifferent, saying nothing, which was exactly what we needed. The hull was designed by Clara Vance. Before Long Patience, Clara had spent 11 years building diplomatic courier ships. She was recruited for one reason. She knew how to make a ship look harmless. From the outside, the unconditional reads like a mid-weight courier, the kind of vessel that carries personnel, sealed files, and diplomatic messages. Not the kind of ship that can ruin someone's day at a strategic level. Clara used to say the best-dressed person in any room is the one nobody worries about. She built the unconditional around that idea. Inside the hull, it was a different story that I need to be careful here. Some technical details are still classified, but the shape of it is simple. In 9 months, human engineers who had never seen Verith weapons from the inside built a working reverse-engineered model. Then they improved it. Then they improved it again. And then once more, the final system was not a copy of Verith technology that IT was an answer to. It built not to match it, but to solve it precisely, the way a strong argument answers the exact point it is meant to defeat. Our shields no longer operated in the harmonic band Verith weapons were tuned to penetrate. Our propulsion systems could hold high-mobility combat speed for lengths of time Verith tactical models believed were impossible for a ship of our mass. The scanning and signal systems were the work of an engineer named Declan Price. 3 times during development, Declan was told that what he wanted to build could not be done. Each time, he did it anyway. His arrays could gather tactical data on any ship within range without sending out a single active scan in detectable pulse and emissions. Nothing a defense grid would flag as surveillance, just presence, just listening. That mattered more than most people understood. Because if your enemy is only looking for scanning behavior, then something that gathers information without scanning may as well be invisible. And the unconditional was not alone. 41 more ships had been built alongside her. Not identical, but related. They had been moved into position in the months before the conclave, scattered at the edges of known space, placed in patterns that needed no communication between them in order to act together. Each captain carried sealed orders. Each ship was dark in active systems that in communication bursts, in signals to intercept. Just quiet ships sitting in the black beyond the sensor range of the conclave station. 41 ships waiting for one coded instruction from me that I had not sent that instruction, that I did not intend to send it. But they were there. Humanity has an old game called chess, older than spaceflight, older than everything that led us into that chamber. There's a term in chess, Zugwang, that IT means a position where the strongest move is not to move at all, where stillness becomes pressure, where your opponent feels the weight of what you could do, even if they cannot yet see its full shape. That was where we had been in that position for 4 months before the conclave. And while Kavaz's aide carried that data core toward the Verith technical station at the side of the chamber, while 17 civilizations waited for the contents of a box no bigger than a human fist, I stood at the podium and thought about Owen Carr, about Clara Vance, about Declan Price, about 41 dark ships waiting in perfect silence beyond sensor range. Then the Verith technician interfaced the core with their reader. The display above the treaty table came alive that I watched Kavaz's face. Here's what was on that core. Not surrender terms, not a statement of capitulation, not reparations, not territorial concessions. What it contained was a live tactical overlay of every Verith ship docked at or orbiting the conclave station. Their positions, their shield harmonics, their crew manifests, their maintenance cycles, projected crew response times in the event of a full alert. 47 individual vulnerability assessments, 0.1 for each ship, accurate enough to use, detailed enough to humiliate. And at the bottom of the display, stamped with time and source data, was one simple line. Data collected passively during standard approach to this station. Collection completed before docking. An active scan conducted. Kavaz looked at the display for a long time. Then he looked at me that I had watched him closely enough to catch the exact instant the situation changed in his mind. That IT was not feared, IT was not anger. IT was the expression of a very intelligent commander discovering that the map he had been using was wrong. Not wrong in detail, wrong in direction. The whole thing had to be redrawn from the beginning. Around him, the chamber reacted in pieces. The Sesseth delegate clicked again. Neutral species leaned into urgent whispers. 0.1 of. The smaller coalition delegates stood up without realizing it, and an aide quietly pulled him back down. I let the display keep running. I let them absorb it in their own time. Then the last layer loaded. Declan's final edition, 41 points of light, appeared across the projection, spread around the station. Each one marked, each one labeled, ship designation, readiness state, distance. All of them sitting just beyond the range the Verith scanners had been watching. The chamber went quiet in a way that did not feel like silence. That IT felt like pressure. Kavaz still had not moved. I respected that. Whatever he was feeling, he refused to show it. He was a commander to the bone. What he said next told me exactly how this meeting was going to end. He spoke softly, almost to himself, but everyone heard it. How long have I had this? It was not really a question that IT was a thought said aloud. I answered anyway. For months, I said. We have been ready for 4 months. The sessive delegate made a layered clicking sound, and this time the translation system rendered it clearly. They waited. Then again, quieter, almost with wonder, they waited. I looked around the chamber, a T-17 civilization seated in rows built for a surrender ceremony, a T the display, still glowing above the treaty table, a T the 41 points of light that were not moving, not threatening, simply existing where they were. Then I said the thing I had come there to say. We sent one ship because we came here to talk. I let that settle. Everything else you see on that display is not a threat. I looked directly at Kava's. It is context. No one spoke for a long moment. And I want to be precise about that moment, because later when people told the story, they often got it wrong. IT was not triumphed. IT was not some dramatic instant where I stood there enjoying the look on their faces. That was never what it felt like. What I felt was something quieter, more careful. The kind of attention that comes when you know the next minute matters more than every other minute before it. Kavas had not spoken since his question. The chamber was still, holding that heavy silence, the kind where everyone knows something has changed, but no one yet knows what it has changed into. Above the treaty table, Declan's overlay kept running, calm, exact, uninterested in the emotions it had created. That I spoke first. Because when you're the only human in a room like that, you cannot wait for someone else to define the moment for you. What you're looking at, I said, keeping my voice even, is not a declaration. It is an explanation. I stepped away from the podium and moved closer to the treaty table, closer to the display. I wanted them to see me next to it, not hidden behind furniture. Distance matters when you're trying to be understood. For 22 months, I said, Earth was quiet. We knew that silence would be read as defeat. We accepted that. We needed the time more than we needed appearances. I looked up at the chamber. What you're seeing now is what we did with that time. Kavas moved then. Only slightly, he straightened by a fraction and turned his full attention from the display back to me. That IT was a small movement, but it told me he had made a decision. He was no longer watching an event unfold. He was listening. I continued. 18 months ago, the Varith Coalition decided that humanity's expansion into the disputed sectors was a threat to regional stability. We disagreed with that assessment. We still do, but we understand why it was made. I paused. And disagreement without capability is not a position. It is a complaint. The room stayed silent. We chose not to complain. A delegate from one of the neutral species leaned forward. Davari, if I remember correctly. Small, quick, impossible to read. I have been told they almost never spoke during formal proceedings. They spoke now. You had the ability to respond 4 months ago, they said. You chose not to. We chose to come here instead. I said, why? It was the same question Kavas had asked, just in different words, and I had been ready for it for a long time. Because the goal was never to prove that we could cause damage, I said. Any civilization with enough desperation and enough engineering time can cause damage. That is not impressive. That is not rare. I looked at the 41 quiet points on the screen. What we wanted to demonstrate was something harder. The sessive delegate made that layered clicking sound again, and after a short delay, the translation system rendered it. Restraint is the message. Yes, I said. Exactly. Kavas spoke then. But the tone had changed. He was no longer using the public ceremonial voice from earlier. This was lower, more direct, the voice of one commander speaking to another after the performance has been set aside. Commander Solis, he said, you are asking us to believe this display is not a weapon. I'm not asking anything yet, I said. I'm explaining what is true. He studied me for a moment. The difference matters to you. It does. He was silent again. But the room had changed. The pressure was still there, the tension too, but the fear that comes from not understanding had started to ease. Understanding does not always make people comfortable. But it does make them clearer. That I could see aides whispering to delegates, that I could see the Davari representative writing on a thin surface at their desk, that I could see several of the smaller coalition members glancing toward Kavas, reading him the way subordinates read a commander. When they need direction and are waiting to see what kind he gave them none, he was thinking that, so I let him think. Finally, he said, if we had continued with the original ceremony, if we had opened that core expecting surrender terms and found this instead, how would you have answered our response? It was the most honest question anyone had asked me all day, and honest questions deserve honest answers. That would have depended entirely on your response, I said. We came prepared for every possible outcome. We were hoping for this one. Hoping, he repeated that I gave a small nod. We are still human. We plan. We prepare. We build things that take 22 months inside the atmosphere of a gas giant. But we still hope. Something changed in his expression then. Not a smile. The Varith do not smile the way humans do. I would not have expected that. But something eased at the slight shift, like a window opening in a room that had been closed too long. He looked back at the display, could see the 41 ships, could see the vulnerability assessments, could see the passive scan data that should not have been possible. You built something extraordinary, he said. We had extraordinary reasons, I said. The people you lost, among other things. I took a breath. We also lost the assumption that being right was enough to keep us safe. We lost the luxury of building ships without understanding the exact problem in front of us. We lost 22 months of comfort for every person who worked on this project because comfort was not available. I looked at him steadily. We are not asking you to honor that, but we are asking you to understand that none of this came from nowhere. Kavas gave a slow nod. Not agreement. Something deeper, acknowledgement, recognition, the kind that says, I hear what you are actually saying. Then he said, the display is on the core. The terms are there too. They are. Summarize them. 3 items, I said. First, restoration of humanity's colonization rights in the disputed sectors we were developing before the war. Second, a non-aggression pact between the Varith Coalition and the Unified Earth Council with a 10-year review clause. Third, I stopped for half a heartbeat. Not for drama, just to make sure the room heard it clearly, a mutual defense article. The chamber broke apart into sound. Voices from every tier at once. Questions in several languages. Aides leaning into their delegates. Even some of Kavas' own officers exchanged looks. The Davari stopped writing. Kavas did not raise his voice that he did not need to. A mutual defense article. He said carefully, yes. You are asking to protect us. We are asking for a formal alliance, I said. Protection goes both ways. That is what the word means. He stared at me. You arrived here as the subject of a surrender ceremony. You have now demonstrated that surrender is not required. And your terms include an offer to defend the civilization that destroyed 3 of your fleets. Yes. Why? I have been waiting for that question too, longer than all the others, because we have been where you put us, I said. That got the room quiet again. Not the old silence, but a different one. One that listens. We know what it is to be the smaller civilization, I said. The one that does not fit the existing order. The one whose movement is read as danger by those who already hold power. We know what it is to be feared before being understood. I let that breathe. We have also known what it is to respond badly to fear. We are not proud of every chapter in our history. No species should be. But we survived long enough to learn something from it. I looked straight at Kavas. We do not want to become that force for anyone else. Not for you. Not for anyone. He did not interrupt. The mutual defense article is not charity, I said. It is the only kind of relationship we are interested in building with our neighbors. Again, the room went quiet. But this time there was openness inside it. Possibility. Something that had not been there when I first walked in. The CESA delegate made another sound, and this time the translator answered almost immediately. They want neighbors. Yes, I said. We do. Kavas looked at me for a long time. Then, for the first time since I had entered that chamber, he looked away. Not dismissively. Not out of anger. He looked away the way people do when they need a moment alone with a thought, even in a room full of witnesses. Then he looked back. I will need to consult with the coalition before any formal response, he said, of course. This will take time. We have plenty of it, I said. We are very good at waiting. And for the first time, something in the set of his face moved in a direction that, under better light, might almost have been amusement. He stood, The chamber stood with him, and I watched 17 civilizations rise in a room built for surrender while the data core sat between us on the treaty table, and 41 dark ships waited in silence beyond sensor range. Above all of us, the dying star continued doing what dying stars do, slowly, without concern, without hurry that a Verith aide guided me from. The chamber to a private anteroom nearby. IT held 2 chairs at a low table, and a wide window that looked directly at the star below. The aide said nothing during the walk that I did not take that personally. The Verith do not waste words. They do not mean that I have always found that quality calming that I sat there for about 10 minutes, watching the star. Then the door opened. Kavas entered alone, and aides, and officers. He closed the door behind him and sat across from me. For a moment, neither of us spoke, that we both looked at the window, the long curve of light from the dying star spilling into the room. That star has about 400 years left, he said. Give or take. I looked at him. I did not know you studied stellar science. I studied everything there was to study about this station before agreeing to hold a conclave here, he said, including the star. He paused. It seemed appropriate for what this meeting was meant to be. An ending, I said. Yes. I looked back at the star. What does a dying star mean in your culture? Completion, he said. Not failure. A thing that spent its energy doing what it was made to do and leaves behind material for what comes next. He paused again. It is considered honorable. I thought about that. We have a similar idea, I said. We just do not usually apply it to stars. He nodded once. Then he said, I want to ask you something directly, and I want a direct answer. All right. He folded his hands. You had the power to act against us 4 months ago. I have reviewed the tactical overlay. I understand what those numbers mean. I'm a military officer. I know exactly what you showed us. His eyes stayed on mine. So why did you not use it? This was not the same question as the one in the chamber. IT sounded similar, but it was different. Before, he had needed to understand the political truth. Now he wanted the human one that I took a moment before answering. Not because I did not know, because I wanted to answer it with the weight it deserved. We have a word, I said. It does not translate well. It sits somewhere between restraint and mercy. But those are not quite right. Those words suggest that something was withheld as a favor to the other side. I shook my head slightly. This is different. The light from the star moved slowly across the floor between us. It is the understanding that force used when it does not need to be used is wasted force. That the measure of what you are capable of is not what you do when you have the advantage. It is what you choose not to do. Kavas was silent for a while. Then he asked, You believe this? I was raised on it, I said. Every human officer is, at least if they are trained well. He said nothing that I continued. We have a long history of doing the wrong thing. Same as everyone else. We have made choices we are not proud of. But when we look back at our best moments, the people we remember are not the ones who had power and used it carelessly. I leaned back slightly. They're the ones who had power and chose carefully. 3 fleets, he said. Yes. That was real loss. Yes. That kind of loss changes people. It does, I said. We are not built not to feel it. I met his eyes, but grief that turns only outward becomes something dangerous. We did not want to destroy. We wanted to solve the problem. The problem being us. The problem being the misunderstanding between us, I said. There is a difference. A problem involving a person can be solved. A person cannot. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, You are a difficult civilization to understand, Commander. I let out a slow breath. We find ourselves difficult to understand too. We have had a long time to practice, and we are still not finished. Something in his posture eased. Not fully. Kavas never looked like a man who relaxed completely. I respected that too. But some tension left him, the kind that leaves only when you realize the thing you prepared yourself for is not coming. Then he said, The mutual defense article. I want to understand it before I take it to the coalition. What would you like to know? If we agree, he said, and later another power attacks the coalition during a conflict we believe is justified, you would still be bound to respond. Yes. Even if you believed we were wrong in that conflict. Yes, I said again. We would respond because you had been attacked. That is what the agreement would mean. I'll let the next part land carefully. That does not mean we would pretend to agree with everything you do. We might disagree very directly. We might say uncomfortable things in private or in public, but we would honor the alliance. He studied me. That is an unusual distinction. We find it necessary, I said. An alliance that only works when everyone agrees on everything is not an alliance. It is a performance. We are offering something real. Real things have edges. He went quiet again. The station rotated a little farther, and the room passed through a warmer line of light. Amber, then gold, then back to neutral. Finally, Chavez said, "Our historians are going to have a great deal to say about today. So will ours." He looked at me. "I wonder how they will describe you." I thought about that honestly. "I hope they do not spend much time describing me," I said. "I hope they describe the decision, not the person who carried it, but the fact that it was possible." There was something in his face then that needed no translation but a kind of respect. Unexpected, clear. "You truly do not care about recognition." "I care about what comes after," I said. "Recognition is just noise around the edges." He stood. The light from the star caught the gray plating across his shoulders, and for a brief moment, he looked less like an enemy and more like what he really was, not a commander, a person who had fought for his people and was now trying to understand whether something better existed on the other side of that fight. Then he did something I had not expected. He extended his hand, that a human gesture that I knew enough about him to understand that he had researched it on purpose, that IT was not part of Varith. Custom, he had chosen ITSO. I took his hand. "I will bring the terms to the coalition," he said, "and I will recommend acceptance." "Thank you," I said. He nodded once and turned toward the door. Then he stopped. Without turning back, he said, "Your ship. Unconditional. The name." "Yes. It means your commitment does not depend on conditions being favorable." I looked at the star through the window. "That is one way to read it," I said. That he left. The door closed behind him, and I sat there for a while longer in that quiet room, watching the light of a dying star spill across the floor, thinking about Owen Carr and about what comes after, and about the possibility that if we had done this exactly right, every month of silence would have been worth it. Outside, beyond the station, 41 ships still waited in darkness, patient, ready, silent, that I never sent. The signal. I never sent the signal. That I never had it. A year later, on a bright Wednesday morning in Geneva, I stood in front of 112 new graduates of the Unified Earth Diplomatic Corps and tried to decide where to begin. The room was the kind that makes you stand a little straighter without thinking about it. High ceilings, tall windows, old walls that had seen enough history that the weight of it stayed in the air. The graduates were watching me, the way people watch someone they expect to tell them something useful. Most of them were young. Not all. Some had come from the military, some from science, some from places that had nothing to do with space at all until something in their life had turned them toward it. I had spent 2 weeks preparing what to say. That I wrote 3 different versions, deleted all of them, because the problem with telling the story of the conclave is that people already know the dramatic parts. The data core on the table, the display lighting up, the 41 ships appearing as points of light. Those parts are real. They happened, but they're not the parts that matter most. And I did not want to stand in front of 112 people who were about to go out and carry the weight of what we had built and give them the exciting version of a story that is actually about something quiet. So I started with something most of them had never heard about. The letter, the data core I placed on the treaty table, I said, contained 3 types of information. They leaned forward slightly. The first was the tactical overlay, the scan data, the vulnerability assessments, the ship positions. A few nodded. They knew that part. The second was the treaty itself, colonization rights, non-aggression terms, the mutual defense article. More nods. That was public record. The third, I said, was something almost no one talks about. Now, they were fully listening. It was a letter. A few exchanged looks. It was written in 43 languages. Every language spoken by every species in that chamber, including 3 languages from neutral observers who had no stake in the outcome. I paused. It was written by Louise Hartley, president of the Unified Earth Council. Some of them recognized the name. Not all. Before politics, I continued. She was a primary school teacher. That part usually surprises people that IT matters because it explains the tone of what she wrote. The letter did not mention ships. It did not mention weapons. It did not mention the tactical display. I let that settle. It was 1 page long. The room was completely quiet now. It said that humanity remembers what it feels like to be the smaller civilization, the one that does not fit, the one that is seen as a threat simply for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. I walked slowly across the front of the room as I spoke. It said that we know what fear the unknown feels like, and that we have not always responded to that fear in ways we are proud of. I stopped. It said that we have no interest in becoming the thing that causes that fear in others. No one moved, and one made a sound. And it said that the offer we placed on that table was not made from strength alone, but from understanding. The understanding that strength without intention is not a foundation. It is just a temporary condition. I took a breath. The last line of the letter, I said, was rewritten 17 times before she was satisfied with it. I looked at them. It said, "We do not send this because we are certain you will agree. We send it because the clearest thing we can say about who we are is not what we built, but why we chose not to use it." I let the silence sit. Then I read the letter to them, slowly, exactly the way it was meant to be read. When I finished, the room was still, not empty still, full still. Then I told them the part they already knew, the chamber, the data core, the display.Kavaz's face. When everything changed, I did not exaggerate. IT did not need that I told them about the private room, about the question, "Why didn't you use it?" About the handshake at the door. Then I told them about Owen Carr, about Clara Vance, about Declan Price. Some of them had heard those names, some had not, but they all understood what those names meant by the time I finished. And then I told them the part most people skip, what happened after. Within 6 months, I said, 3 of the 7 Verith species began cultural exchange programs with Earth. That got their attention. Not military, not political, cultural, education, research, shared work. I saw curiosity now. A Verith scholar named Aiken spent 8 months at the University of Edinburgh studying applied ethics. He found the weather confusing and fascinating at the same time. A few smiles, small ones, that matters, I said, because it means something changed. I continued. 2 of the remaining coalition species chose to observe from a distance, which was their right, and we respected that completely. Then I paused. The 7th species, the Durith, requested a separate meeting. The room sharpened again. They did not challenge the treaty. They asked a question. I looked at them. They wanted to know how we kept 41 crews in complete silence for 4 months without a single one breaking protocol. That question always lands, because it is the real one, not how we built the ships, how we held them still. It was a good question, I said, and the answer is not technical. I let that sit. Every captain received, along with their sealed orders, a copy of that same letter. Now, they understood. Every one of them read it. I nodded slowly, and every one of them understood that their silence was not passive. I let my voice drop slightly. It was the mission. They were not waiting because they had nothing to do. They were waiting because that was the most important thing they could do. Not one of them broke silence. Not one. I stopped speaking for a moment. Let it settle. The young man in the 4th row raised his hand. "Did you ever doubt it?" he asked. In the room, when Kavaz was deciding, "Did you think it might fail?" It was an honest question. I gave him an honest answer. Yes. I nodded once, multiple times. I took a step closer to the front row. There are moments in that day, several of them, where a different decision from anyone in that room could have changed everything. I looked directly at him. Doubt is not a sign your plan is wrong. It is a sign you understand the stakes. He nodded slowly. "What did you do with it?" he asked the doubt. I gave a small breath. "You listen to it. You check your thinking against it. And if your reasoning still holds," I paused. "You keep moving." He wrote that down. I looked at the rest of the room. The T-112 people who were about to step into a galaxy that was wider and more complicated than it had been before the conclave. And that was saying something, because the galaxy is always more complicated than whatever version of it you thought you understood yesterday. "There's one more thing," I said. "This matters more than everything else I've told you." The room leaned in again. The fleet was ready. I said it clearly, every word deliberate, every ship, every crew, every system calibrated. We had the ability to change that situation by force within hours. I let that sit, and we had that ability for 4 months. Silence. We sent one ship. I looked at them. We placed a letter at the end of a data core. We sat in a room and had an honest conversation. I stopped. Then I said the only thing that mattered. Remember why? No one moved. Outside the windows, Geneva moved through its morning the way it always does. Calm, unhurried. If urgency is something other people worry about. After the ceremony, I walked down to the hangar where the unconditional was docked for maintenance. That IT looked the same as always. Simple. Unassuming that a courier ship. Clara's design, doing exactly what it was meant to do. That I walked around the hull once. I had started doing that before every departure. I never fully understood why. I just knew it mattered. And then I noticed something new. Near the rear, close to the engine housing, subtle, painted in a shade almost identical to the hull. Easy to miss unless the light hit it just right. At IT was a word that I in Verith script. I took out my translation device, pointed it at the marking that IT processed for a second. Then it translated, neighbor. I read the extended meaning. Close companion. One who stays. One whose presence is chosen, not assigned. The one who remains. I stood there for a while, just looking at it. A maintenance officer named Pete came around the corner, wiping his hands. Almost walked into me. "Oh, sorry, Commander," he said. "Didn't see you." He followed my gaze. "Oh, that. Verith team came by last week. Asked permission. Thought it was a nice touch." "It is," I said. He looked at the word again. "What does it say?" "Neighbor," I said. "More or less." He nodded slowly. "Long word for that." "It's their longest one," I said. He looked at it again. Then nodded once like that explained something, and went back to work. That I stayed there, watching the light shift, watching the word fade back into the hull as the angle changed, and then I stayed a little longer, thinking about Owen Carr, about Louise Hartley, about 41 crews sitting in silence, about the quiet, stubborn idea that what you choose not to do can matter just as much as what you do. One ship was enough. That IT always had been. One ship was enough. That IT always had been. But that is not the part people remember. When stories like this travel, they change shape. They become louder, sharper, simpler than they were when they actually happened. People remember the display, the 41 ships. The moment the room went quiet, they remember power. They do not always remember restraint. And if you miss that part, you miss the whole point. Let me tell you something most official reports leave out. After the conclave ended, after the agreements were signed and the delegates returned to their systems, there was a period of adjustment. That is the polite word. The real word is uncertainty, because power, once revealed, changes the space around it, even when it is not used, especially when it is not used. There were civilizations who looked at what we had shown and felt relief. There were others who felt concern, and a few who felt something closer to fear. Not because of what we did, because of what we could have done. That distinction matters. We understood that we did something that at the time seemed small. But in hindsight, it mattered more than the display. That we did not expand. Not immediately. Not into the sectors we had just secured the right to return to. We waited. Again. Not because we had to. Because we chose to. There's a pattern in this if you're paying attention. The galaxy was watching. Trying to understand if what happened at the conclave had been an exception or a rule. Trying to decide if humanity was a problem that had been temporarily solved or something else entirely. We gave them time to decide. That we opened communication channels first. Scientific exchanges, cultural exchanges, shared infrastructure projects in neutral zones. Small things, unimpressive things, the kind of work that does not make headlines but builds something real. Because trust is not built in moments. IT is built in repetition. In consistency. In the quiet space between dramatic events. That I was assigned to oversight for some of those early exchanges, which meant a lot of time in rooms that looked nothing like the conclave chamber. Smaller rooms, simpler, tables instead of stages, conversations instead of performances. That I remember one meeting in particular. That a Verith systems analyst named Reth. That we were reviewing joint navigation protocols for shared traffic lanes. Routine work. Necessary. Not interesting, at least on the surface. At the T1 point, he stopped mid-sentence, looked at me, and said, "You could have ended us." It was not an accusation that IT was not even emotional. That IT was a statement, that a fact he was still processing. "Yes," I said. That he nodded once. Then he said, "You did not." No, he considered that. "For my people," he said slowly, "that is difficult to categorize." I understood. "Then do not categorize it yet," I said. "Just observe it." He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded again, and we went back to work. That is what most of it looked like. Not grand gestures, not speeches, moments like that, small shifts in understanding, repeated enough times that they start to become something stable, something reliable, something real. That a few months after that, I received a message from Declan Price. Short that in "Oh greeting," in "Oh explanation." Just a single line. They stopped scanning us aggressively. I stared at that message for a while, because I knew exactly what it meant. For months before the conclave, various systems had been probing every human vessel at the edge of their range, constantly looking for weaknesses, patterns, openings. After the conclave, that behavior changed. Not completely. They were still cautious, still careful, but the intent had shifted. Less searching for vulnerability, more observing for consistency. That is a different kind of attention, not a better one. Clara sent a message a few weeks later. A picture, the unconditional, docked at a joint station. Two Verith vessels nearby. Close, closer than standard protocol would have allowed before. The caption read, "They parked next to us." No explanation. None needed. I thought about that for a long time. Because proximity is trust, not words, not agreements, distance. Or the absence of it. That is where trust lives. Months turned into a year. The agreement held. Not perfectly. Nothing real ever does. There were disagreements. There were tensions. There were moments where old habits pushed forward and had to be corrected on both sides. But the structure held, because it had been built on something stronger than advantage. IT had been built on choice, and choice, when repeated, becomes identity. I was called back to the unconditional for a routine systems review about 18 months after the conclave. Routine. That word again. I'm starting to think there are no routine things. Only things we have seen often enough that we stop noticing how important they are. The ship was the same. Of course, it was. Clara's design does not age quickly. IT still looked like something you would overlook if you were not paying attention. That was the point. I walked the hull again. The same path, the same habit. And I stopped at the same place near the engine housing. The Verith word was still there, faint, almost invisible unless you knew where to look, but had changed. Not the word itself, the context. There were marks around it now. Small, subtle, not damage. Additions, other scripts, other languages, different species. Each one placed carefully, each one meaning something similar. Not identical, but close enough that the pattern was clear. Neighbor, ally, companion, presence chosen, presence kept. I stood there for a long time. Long enough that the light shifted twice. Long enough that the word appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Pete found me there again. Of course he did it. He always seemed to appear when I was standing still too long. He followed my gaze. "Yeah," he said. "They've been adding those. I can see that. Started with the Verith, then the Davari, then a couple others. They ask every time." I nodded good. He leaned against the hull, arms crossed. "You know," he said, "for a ship that doesn't look like much, this one's getting a reputation." I allowed myself a small smile. It always was. He looked at the markings again. "Funny thing," he said. "All that work, all those systems, all that capability." He tapped lightly on the hull. "And this is what people leave behind." I looked at the words. The layers of meaning added one by one. "Yes," I said, "because this is what mattered." He nodded slowly, like he understood more than he was saying. Then he pushed off the hull and went back to work. I stayed, just for a little while longer, thinking about everything that had led to that moment. The silence, the waiting, the choice, and I realized something then. Something simple. Something that had been there from the beginning. That we did not win that day at the conclave. That is not the right word. Winning implies an opponent, an outcome where one side gains and the other loses. That is not what happened. What happened was that we changed the shape of the situation from something that could only end one way into something that could become many things, better things, harder things, more complicated things, but real things. And that only happened because we chose not to take the easier path. The faster one. The louder one. Power makes a lot of things possible, but it does not make all things possible. Some things only exist if you choose not to use it. That is the part people forget. That is the part one want you to remember. Because one day, whether you're in a room like that conclave chamber or somewhere much smaller, you're going to have a choice. You'll have the ability to a CT.TO force and outcome.TO take control of a situation quickly. And you will believe, with very good reasons, that you are right. You might even be right. That is not the question. The question is what happens after. What kind of world your action creates. What kind of pattern it sets. What kind of story it starts, because those things last longer than the moment, longer than the victory, longer than the memory of who stood. When I looked once more at the hull of the unconditional the words written in languages that had not existed in the same place before. The quiet proof of something that had been built without being announced. And I thought about the simplest version of it, the one that does not need translation. That we sent one ship, because one ship was all it should ever take to start a conversation. Because in the end, that was the point. Not the ships, not the systems, not even the outcome. The point was the choice. And choices like that do not just happen once. They repeat in different rooms, in different forms, with different stakes. At a few months after I returned to active command rotation, I was asked a question during a closed strategy session. Not by a diplomat, not by a politician. By a junior officer, new to command, still carrying that mix of confidence and uncertainty that comes with responsibility arriving faster than experience. He said, if they hadn't accepted, would you have sent the signal? The room went quiet. Not because it was a dangerous question, because it was the right one. I took a moment before answering. Not for effect, because the answer deserved to be accurate. Yes, I said. There was no reason to soften it. No. I added, just as clearly. He frowned slightly. I could see the confusion. I explained. We were prepared to act, I said. Fully, completely, without hesitation if it became necessary. I paused. But necessity is not something you decide alone. That part matters. Necessity is something that becomes true when there are no better options left. I looked around the room. At the conclave, there were still better options. I let that sit. If those options had disappeared, then yes. The officer nodded slowly, not fully satisfied, but thinking that was enough, because understanding like that does not arrive all at once. At IT builds, layer by layer, the same way everything else does. Later that day, I went back to the unconditional. Not because I needed to, because I wanted to. There's something grounding about standing next to the thing that carries the weight of your decisions, even when it looks like nothing special. Especially then, the hangar was quiet, maintenance crews moving in. That steady rhythm that keeps everything running without ever drawing attention to itself. That I walked the hull again. Same path, same habit. That I stopped at the markings. They had grown. More languages, more symbols, carefully placed. None overlapping, none competing, each one adding to the whole. That I ran my hand lightly across the surface. You could barely feel the difference where the paint changed. That seemed right. Pete was there again. Of course he was. He glanced at me. Then at the markings, still adding to it. He said, I see that. They don't coordinate it, he added. Different crews, different species. They just come by, ask permission, leave something behind. I nodded. That matters more than coordination. He looked at me sideways. Why is that? Because it means it's not planned, I said. It's chosen. He thought about that, then nodded once. Yeah, he said. That tracks. We stood there for a moment in comfortable silence. Then he went back to work, and I stayed because sometimes the quiet moments are the ones that tell you whether something actually worked. Not the speeches, not the agreements, not the records, the small things, the things people do when no one is asking them to. I thought about the conclave, about the chamber, about the moment Kavas asked why we sent one ship. And I realized something I had not put into words before. That we had not sent one ship because that was all we needed. We sent one ship because that was all we were willing to use. There's a difference. Point one is about capability. The other is about identity. And identity is what lasts. Years later, people would still ask about that day in interviews, in briefings, in conversations that started casual and became something else halfway through. They always asked the same version of the same question. Were you afraid? I always answered the same way. Yes. Because I was not of losing, not of the Verith, not even of making the wrong move in that moment, that I was afraid of something quieter. Something harder to see, that I was afraid of becoming the kind of civilization that forgets why it built something in the first place, that uses power simply because it exists, that confuses the ability to act with the need to act. That is the kind of mistake that does not look like a mistake when you make IT to IT looks like confidence to IT looks like strength. Until later. Much later, when you start to see what it cost. Oh yes, that I was afraid. And that fear was useful, because it kept me careful, that IT kept me focused on the only thing that mattered. Not what we could do, what we should do. There's a difference. And if you lose that difference, you lose everything that comes after. The unconditional eventually return to regular duty. Courier work, diplomatic transport, quiet assignments. The kind that do not get recorded in history. Exactly the kind it was built for. But it was never just a courier ship again. Not really. Every port it entered. Every station it docked at. Every system it passed through. People noticed it. Not because it looked different, because they knew what it represented. And sometimes when the light hit the hull just right, you could see the markings, the words layered, fading in and out depending on where you stood. You had to be in the right place to see them clearly. That felt appropriate. Some things are not meant to be obvious. Some things are meant to be understood. There is a difference. Point one last thing. Because if you have listened this far, this is the part that matters most. Stories like this get told as if they're about a single moment, that a single decision, that a single room. They are not. They are about everything that led up to that moment. Every person who chose to do their work carefully. Every engineer who refused to stop when told something was impossible. Every crew member who sat in silence because they understood why it mattered. Every leader who chose patience when speed would have been easier. That is what makes a moment like that possible, not the moment itself. The foundation under IT.so, if you're looking for the lesson in all of this, it is not complicated. Build carefully. Think clearly. Choose deliberately. And when the moment comes, when you have the power to act, make sure you understand what your action will create, not just in that moment, but after. Because that is the part you have to live with. We sent one ship, not because we had to, because we chose to, and that choice changed everything.